The late summer of 1982 hung heavy and sweet in the air, a golden haze settling over the suburban streets of Elmwood. The sun, a drowsy orange orb, dipped lazily behind the mature oak trees that lined Sycamore Drive, casting long, purple shadows across manicured lawns. A faint, distant hum of lawnmowers faded into the chirping of crickets, and the air, still thick with the day's heat, carried the promise of cooler evenings, a fleeting comfort before autumn truly took hold. Mikey, 15 and perpetually caught between the gangly awkwardness of boyhood and the burgeoning self-consciousness of a young man, sprawled like a discarded puppet on the worn floral couch in the living room. The fabric, a dizzying pattern of faded roses and ivy, had long ago molded to the contours of family life, dips and hollows marking favorite spots. A dog-eared copy of Dune rested open on his chest, its pages faintly smelling of dust and imagination. But his gaze was fixed on the ceiling, tracing the hairline cracks in the plaster that looked like miniature rivers on a map. He wasn't truly reading, he was listening. From the kitchen, the familiar drone of the evening news drifted, a low, steady murmur of distant headlines and weather forecasts that formed the backdrop to their domestic symphony. It was punctuated by the rhythmic clatter of plates being set, the gentle thud of cutlery, and the low, comforting murmur of his parents' voices. Dinner, in the Miller household, was always a ritual, a comforting anchor in the week's steady drift. It wasn't just food, it was a daily reaffirmation of their world, a quiet, unspoken promise that some things, at least, remained constant. His mother, Eleanor, would be bustling, her movements efficient and practiced, a faint dusting of flour clinging to the front of her favorite blue apron from the biscuits she'd baked. The scent of them, warm and buttery, mingled with the savory aroma of roast chicken, a smell that always pulled Mikey from whatever corner of the universe he was exploring in his books. Eleanor believed in a good, hearty meal, something to ground them after a long day. His father, Arthur, would already be at the head of the table, quiet but undeniably present, his calloused hands, marked by years of working the assembly line at the local auto parts factory, turning the pages of the evening paper with a soft rustle. Arthur was a man of routine, of quiet dependability, his steady, demanding job etching faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, but never eroding his quiet strength. Mikey loved these evenings. He loved the specific way the light caught the steam rising from his plate, the easy rhythm of their conversations, the feeling of being utterly, securely home. He could hear his mother now, her voice a gentle chiding, tinged with affection, about his father leaving his tools on the porch again. "Arthur, honestly," she'd say, "someone's going to trip over that wrench." Arthur's reply was a soft rumble, something about forgetting after a long day, the words almost swallowed by the turning of a page. It was the ordinary hum of a family, a sound Mikey had always taken for granted, believing with the unshakable certainty of youth that it would last forever, an unbreakable melody. Then came the shift, subtle at first, like a distant storm cloud on a clear day, barely visible on the horizon, yet carrying an undeniable weight. Arthur had been away for 3 days, a supposed work trip to a supplier plant upstate. Mikey remembered the morning he left, a Tuesday. His father's usual terse goodbye, a quick, almost perfunctory pat on his mother's shoulder, a nod in Mikey's direction as he carried his small, scuffed overnight bag to the car. It was all very ordinary, unremarkable. But his return, late on a Tuesday evening 2 weeks later, was different. The front door opened with its familiar creak, a sound that usually heralded the comforting jingle of keys being tossed onto the small ceramic dish in the hall, the solid thud of his briefcase dropping to the floor, Arthur's characteristic sigh of relief after the long drive. Tonight, however, those expected sounds were absent. Instead, a profound, unsettling silence seeped into the house, a vacuum that seemed to precede Arthur himself. Mikey, roused from a shallow sleep by a feeling of vague unease rather than any specific noise, crept cautiously to the top of the stairs. The house was mostly dark, save for the weak glow of the porch light filtering through the front door, casting long, distorted shadows. He saw his father then, silhouetted against that pale rectangle of light. Arthur didn't call out, didn't utter the usual, "I'm home." He didn't even greet Eleanor, who had rushed from the kitchen at the sound of the door, her face a mixture of relief and mild annoyance at his lateness. Arthur's shoulders were hunched, his posture oddly collapsed, his movements stiff, almost mechanical, as if each step was a deliberate, painful effort. His eyes, when they briefly met Eleanor's, held a distant, haunted look Mikey had never seen before, a vacantness that sent a shiver down his spine even from his perch on the stairs. Eleanor, her initial relief instantly replaced by a deep, etching concern, stepped closer. "Arthur, what happened on your trip? Is everything all right?" Her voice, usually so steady, wavered slightly. "Fine," Arthur mumbled, his voice raspy, barely audible, like gravel shifting in a dry riverbed. "Tired." He offered no details, no anecdotes about the road, no complaints about traffic or the supplier. Nothing of the usual weary traveler's grumbles. He simply bypassed the living room, the kitchen, and went straight to his small study at the back of the house, a room he usually only retreated to for bills or quiet reading. He closed the door softly behind him, a sound that was less a click and more a quiet, decisive sealing off. The house felt suddenly colder, the air thick with an unspoken weight, a new, heavy presence that had walked in with Arthur. Eleanor stood in the hallway for a long moment, her hand pressed to her chest, her brow furrowed with a worry that seemed to deepen with each passing second. She glanced up the stairs, a quick, almost imperceptible flick of her eyes towards Mikey's shadowed form, before turning off the porch light. The house plunged into near darkness, and she retreated slowly to the kitchen, the unsettling silence following her like a tangible shadow, clinging to the linoleum and the countertops. Days bled into a week, then two, and the silence around Arthur solidified into a tangible wall. He ate dinner with them each evening, a phantom presence at the head of the table, but his gaze was fixed on his plate, or out the window at the deepening twilight, never truly engaging. He'd nod, grunt, offer monosyllabic answers when directly addressed, but the warmth, the quiet, dependable presence Mikey knew, had utterly vanished. The days that followed were a tortuous blend of routine and profound unease, a thin veneer of normalcy stretched taut over a deepening chasm. Eleanor moved through the house with a distracted air, her initial frustration with Arthur's retreat slowly morphing into a pervasive, aching worry that settled heavy in her chest. Mikey often found her staring blankly out the kitchen window, a dishcloth forgotten in her hand, the late afternoon sun casting long, indifferent shadows across the linoleum. Her gaze would be fixed on nothing in particular, her mouth a thin, worried line, as if she were trying to decipher some invisible message in the swaying branches of the elm tree outside. She tried to speak to Arthur, gentle inquiries turning into more direct pleas that hung in the air, unanswered. One evening, as the supper dishes clattered softly in the sink, Mikey heard her voice from the living room, a low, insistent hum. "Arthur, please," she said, the tremor in her voice barely contained. "Talk to me. Whatever it is, we can face it together. We always have." There was a pause, thick with unexpressed pain, and then Mikey heard a low, inarticulate sound from his father, a choked-off sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. A moment later, the familiar creak of the study door echoed, a sound of finality, sealing Arthur away once more in his sanctuary of silence. Eleanor stood by the sink for a long time, her back to Mikey, her shoulders slumped, the dishwater growing cold around her hands. He wanted to go to her, to offer some comfort, but the words caught in his throat, and he just watched the slow, deliberate movements of her drying her hands, her gaze still distant. Arthur became a ghost in his own home, moving silently, his footsteps muffled, his presence a void rather than a comfort. He ate little, pushing food around his plate at dinner, his eyes often bloodshot from sleepless nights. Mikey noticed the small, telling changes. The way his father would sometimes pause, mid-stride, in the hallway, staring at nothing, a deep, weary furrow appearing between his brows, as if wrestling with an invisible opponent. Or the way he'd absent-mindedly traced patterns on the tabletop with his finger, his mind clearly miles away. The clinking of cutlery and the murmur of Eleanor's attempts at conversation unable to penetrate the wall he had built around himself. The silence wasn't just a lack of words. It was a heavy, suffocating presence, a constant, unspoken reminder of the unknown burden his father carried. A burden that was slowly crushing the warmth from their home. Unable to articulate his fears to his mother, unwilling to add to her visible distress, Mikey began his own quiet investigation. One afternoon, while Arthur was at work and Eleanor had gone to the supermarket, he pulled an old road atlas from the bottom shelf of the living room bookcase. The cover was faded, the pages brittle with age, smelling faintly of dust and forgotten journeys. He laid it flat on the carpet, tracing his finger across the map of the state, searching for Millersburg. His heart thumped a nervous rhythm against his ribs as he found it, a tiny dot nestled in a valley, miles away from Elmwood, a place Arthur had vehemently denied knowing. The denial, so sharp and absolute, now felt like a deliberate lie, a shard of ice in Mikey's stomach. Driven by a restless energy, a need to fill the aching void of not knowing, Mikey grabbed his bicycle. The chain squeaked rhythmically as he pedaled the familiar route to the public library, a sturdy brick building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. Inside, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the rustle of turning pages were a comforting backdrop to his clandestine quest. He feigned research for a school project, pulling out a thick volume on local history, but his real attention was on the shelves housing old gazetteers and regional newspapers. He found a brief, dry entry for Millersburg in an almanac from the 60s, describing it as a small agricultural town, unremarkable in every way except for its sudden, profound significance to his family. Then, a stroke of luck, a microfiche reader, tucked away in a dimly lit corner, dusty and seldom used, caught his eye. It hummed softly as he loaded the tiny reel, the magnified images of old newsprint flickering across the screen. He scrolled through archived local newspapers from the mid-60s, his fingers aching from the constant turning of the knob, his eyes straining to read the faded text. He found nothing specific to Millersburg in the Elmwood papers, but a small, regional weekly, the Valley Echo, carried a few mentions. He scrolled, frame by frame, through 1965, the year on the back of the photograph. His breath hitched as he saw it. A small article, tucked away on an inside page, almost an afterthought. Tragic accident claims young life in Millersburg. The headline sent a jolt through him, a cold wave washing over his skin despite the warm library air. He leaned closer, his eyes devouring the words. The article detailed a car accident on a winding country road just outside Millersburg. A young woman, Sarah Jenkins, 19, had been killed. The driver, a local boy named Thomas, had been injured. There was no mention of Arthur. But the date, September 1965, aligned perfectly with the photograph. Sarah. Could she be the woman in the photo? The thought hit Mikey with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty. He pictured his father, young and smiling, his arm around this vibrant Sarah, her bright eyes and confident smile. And then, the accident. The weight of it, the sudden, brutal end to a young life, pressed down on him, a crushing sorrow that wasn't his own, yet felt intensely personal. He imagined his father, then 20, grappling with such a tragedy, the immense, unbearable grief. It explained the silence, the profound, hidden sorrow, the carefully secreted photograph. It explained everything. That night, the tension in their house reached a breaking point. A palpable current that crackled beneath the surface of every quiet word and averted gaze. Mikey lay in bed, feigning sleep, the sounds of the house amplified in the darkness. He listened to the hushed, strained voices from his parents' bedroom, a low murmur at first, then Eleanor's voice, raw with emotion, finally confronting Arthur. "Arthur, I can't do this anymore," she pleaded, her voice cracking, each word a desperate plea. "I love you, but this silence is killing me. It's killing us. What happened? Please, just tell me. I deserve to know." There was a long, agonizing pause. A silence so profound Mikey felt his own breath catch in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He imagined his father, silent, unreachable, and then, he heard Arthur's voice, broken, barely a whisper, ragged with a pain that seemed to tear at his very core. I went back there, Ellie, Arthur choked out, the words thick, each one an effort. Millersburg, I shouldn't have. It brought it all back. He didn't elaborate, didn't say what it was, didn't mention Sarah or the accident, but the raw anguish in his voice was unmistakable. A sound Mikey had never heard from his father before. A mistake, Arthur murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears, the words heavy with regret. A terrible mistake. Eleanor didn't press him further. Mikey heard a soft rustle, perhaps her moving closer, then soft, comforting sounds, low murmurs of reassurance. He knew, without seeing, that her own tears were mingling with his, a shared grief finally breaking through the wall of silence. Mikey, listening from his room, felt a profound shift, a release of the suffocating tension that had gripped their home for weeks. His father wasn't angry, wasn't rejecting them. He was simply drowning in a sorrow too vast to articulate, a private ocean of grief that had finally overflowed. The mystery wasn't about a betrayal, not a secret kept from malice, but a wound. A deep, festering wound that had never healed, now exposed and bleeding anew. The next morning, as the first light filtered through his window, Mikey looked at the faded photograph again. The young Sarah's smile, once a source of confusion, seemed even more poignant now, a ghost of joy from a past that refused to stay buried. Mikey found Arthur in the garage, the faint, comforting smell of oil and sawdust hanging in the air, a familiar scent that usually meant his father was lost in the quiet rhythm of his work. Tonight, though, the silence felt different. Arthur was hunched over a workbench, meticulously cleaning a carburetor, his back to the door, his shoulders set in that familiar, stoic posture Mikey knew so well. The radio, usually a constant companion playing classic rock hits, was off. Only the faint, almost surgical scraping of a wire brush against metal broke the heavy quiet. Mikey stood for a long moment just inside the garage door, watching the rise and fall of his father's shoulders, the weary set of his head. He clutched the faded photograph in his hand, its edges softened by time, the paper warm from his pocket. The weight of the secret, now shared, now understood, pressed against him. He didn't want to accuse, didn't want to force a confession. He just wanted to offer a bridge, a way out of the silent prison his father had built around himself. "Dad?" Mikey's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, a tentative thread against the quiet. Arthur flinched, a sudden, almost violent jerk of his shoulders, his whole frame tensing. Slowly, as if moving through thick water, he turned. His eyes, usually guarded and unreadable, widened slightly when they met Mikey's, a flicker of surprise giving way to a dawning apprehension, a deep-seated dread. His gaze dropped immediately to the photograph Mikey held out, not as evidence, but as an offering, a fragile truce. Mikey walked slowly towards him, the concrete floor cold beneath his sneakers, stopping a few feet away, close enough for the unspoken to pass between them. "I went to Millersburg," Mikey said, his voice trembling slightly, but firm, holding steady against the tremor that threatened to overtake it. "I found out about Sarah." Arthur's gaze remained fixed on the faded image in Mikey's hand. The young man in the photograph, joyful and carefree, stared back at him from another lifetime. His face, already pale from the garage's dim light, seemed to drain of all remaining color, leaving behind a stark, ashen mask. His hands, still clutching the carburetor, began to tremble uncontrollably, the metal rattling against the workbench with a small, sharp sound. He didn't speak. He didn't move, only stared at the photograph, his eyes clouding over with a deep, bottomless sorrow that Mikey had never witnessed before, a raw, exposed pain that twisted his own gut. Mikey felt a surge of fear, a cold wave washing over him. He worried he had broken something irreparable, shattered the fragile peace his father had constructed around his grief. But he pushed past it, the image of Mrs. Albright's kind, sad eyes urging him on. "It wasn't your fault, Dad," he said again, his voice stronger this time, a plea, a truth, a desperate offering of absolution. Arthur's breath hitched, a ragged, guttural sound that seemed torn from deep within him. The carburetor slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly on the concrete floor, the sudden noise echoing in the sudden, profound silence. He didn't even seem to notice it. His gaze lifted slowly from the photograph, meeting Mikey's, and in those eyes, Mikey saw a lifetime of unwept tears, a crushing weight of guilt that had bent his father's spirit. Arthur started, his voice a dry rasp, then broke off, unable to form words. A single tear, hesitant and slow, tracked a path down his weathered cheek, a river breaking its dam after decades. Then another, and another, until his face was streaked with them. He didn't sob, didn't wail. He simply stood there, trembling, tears falling silently, the sheer, quiet devastation of it more powerful than any outburst. Mikey felt his own throat tighten, tears stinging his eyes. He reached out, slowly, tentatively, and placed his free hand on his father's arm, a gesture he hadn't made since he was a small boy. Arthur didn't flinch away. Instead, his shoulders slumped, the rigid posture dissolving into something vulnerable, defeated. He looked at Mikey, his eyes red-rimmed and full of an ancient pain, but also, for the first time in Mikey's memory, a flicker of something else. Relief. "I should have," Arthur managed, his voice barely audible. "I should have told you." "It's okay, Dad," Mikey whispered, his hand tightening on his father's arm. "It's okay now." He didn't know if it was okay, not really. But it was a start. He understood now, not just the facts, but the deep, internal landscape of his father's suffering. The silence had been a shield, a self-imposed penance. Arthur slowly reached out a shaking hand, not to take the photograph, but to gently touch Mikey's hand, resting on his arm. His touch was hesitant, almost questioning. It was a silent acknowledgement, a fragile connection forged in the crucible of shared grief. They stood like that for a long time, the smell of oil and sawdust, the fallen carburetor, the faded photograph, all witnesses to a wall crumbling, brick by silent brick. Later that evening, the house was quieter than usual, yet somehow fuller. The television hummed softly in the living room, but no one was really watching. Arthur sat in his armchair, a mug of lukewarm coffee in his hands, staring into the middle distance. His eyes were still a little red, but the hard, guarded line around his mouth had softened, replaced by a weary openness. Mikey sat on the floor, leaning against the sofa, absently flipping through a magazine. His mother, sensing a shift she couldn't yet fully articulate, moved between them, her movements a little gentler, her glances lingering. She hadn't been told everything, not yet, but the air was different. Lighter, somehow. Arthur cleared his throat. "You know," he said, his voice still a little rough, but steady. "Sarah." She had this laugh. Sounded like wind chimes. He paused, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips, a ghost of a memory. "She always wanted to go to California. Said she'd open a little flower shop by the ocean." Mikey looked up, meeting his father's gaze. There was regret, still, a deep, abiding sorrow, but also a warmth, a tenderness that had been locked away for so long. It was the first time Arthur had ever spoken of her, not just to Mikey, but to anyone in their family. It was a small offering, a hesitant step into the light. "That sounds nice," Mikey said, his voice soft. He didn't know what else to say, but his father didn't seem to need more. Arthur nodded, looking back at his coffee mug. "Yeah," he murmured, a faint, wistful sigh escaping him. "It would have been." He took a slow sip. The silence that followed now less of a burden and more of a quiet understanding. The photograph, now resting on the mantelpiece, no longer felt like a ghost. It was a memory, painful but cherished, finally allowed to breathe in the open. The next morning, Mikey came down for breakfast to find his father already at the kitchen table, a fresh pot of coffee brewing. Arthur looked up, and for the first time in years, a small, genuine smile touched his lips, a smile that reached his eyes. "Morning, son," he said, his voice easy, unburdened. He pushed a plate of toast towards Mikey. "Sleep all right?" Mikey nodded, a lump in his throat. "Yeah, Dad, I did." He sat down opposite him, the light catching the dust motes dancing in the morning sun. The air between them, once thick with unspoken history, now felt clear, a new space opening up. Arthur reached for the newspaper, but before he opened it, he paused, his gaze meeting Mikey's across the table. A quiet understanding passed between them, a recognition of a shared truth, a pain acknowledged, and a fragile, burgeoning hope. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of the things that had finally been said, and the things that no longer needed to be. Mikey watched his father, truly seeing him, and knew that some wounds never fully healed, but they could, at last, begin to mend. If this story left any impression on you, or reminded you of a moment from your own life, feel free to share it in the comments. Even a small memory is enough. Stories from the past often carry meaning we only begin to understand much later. Your memory might become part of someone else's story. If you'd like to catch a new story at the same time every day, subscribe and turn on notifications.